Before I jump into today's story, I would like to bring up my friend Jonathan's book, Lumilin and Love You. You can get this on Amazon as paperback, or you can download it directly to your Kindle. It's really cool because it's written like a script. So if you get paperback, you can order multiple copies. They're like $4 or $5. And you can highlight your lines, and each person in your family can have their own lines that they stick to for their character. It's something that you can do with your kids, and it'll help you build that familial bond. Aside from that, the message in the book is really great, and I highly suggest you go and get yourself a copy or few and do this together. Now let's get on with our story.
It's been hard in America. It's been tough, feeling sad. It's been hard in America. I never thought it'd get so bad. I wish that I had a big jet plane, fly the tears away. Maybe I'd find a river so wide and drift away all of the pain. But it seems there's more to do. There's more to love we've yet to find. Oh yeah, it's true, we may stumble through, but all we have is precious time.
Here's a question that sounds like the setup to a bad joke. What do you call a place where your boss pays your wages, owns your house, runs your grocery store, controls the police, picks the preacher, and can throw you out of town if you complain? Most people today would call that a dystopian movie. For a huge stretch of modern history, it had a much simpler name. People just called it home. Company towns were places built, owned, and controlled by a single employer, usually a mine, mill, or factory. On paper, they were supposed to be convenient. In reality, they gave us one of the clearest pictures of what happens when work stops being just a job and starts becoming your entire world. Company towns didn't begin as some cartoon villain plot. To the people building them, they looked like a practical solution. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, industrial companies were racing to pull coal out of mountains, timber out of forests, and ore out of the ground. The problem was simple. The places with the most resources usually had the fewest people. There were no suburbs, no apartment blocks, and sometimes not even a real main street. If you wanted hundreds or thousands of workers in a place where nobody was living yet, you either waited for a town to grow up around you or built one yourself. The second option was faster, and it came with one very important advantage. When you build the town, you don't just provide housing, you also get to set the rules. For workers, especially immigrants and poor families, it could look like a pretty good deal at first. A company town meant steady work, a roof over your head, a school for the kids, and a church within walking distance. Compared to the chaos of big city slums, a clean little town tucked into a valley with rows of houses, a store on the corner, and a doctor nearby didn't look sinister. The brochures and newspaper articles talked about modern sanitation, tree-lined streets, and decent, family-friendly living. That was the pitch, and like most pitches, the fine print didn't really show up until people had already moved in and unpacked their lives. To understand how the trap worked, you have to start with the paycheck. In a normal town, your employer pays you, then you decide where your money goes. You can shop at different stores, move to a different neighborhood, or leave for another city entirely. In a company town, that freedom was mostly an illusion. The company paid you, the company owned the housing, and the company ran the only store in town that really mattered. Even when workers were technically paid in US currency, most of what they spent still flowed right back into the same hands. Then there were the towns that didn't even bother using regular money. Instead, workers were paid in company script, little metal tokens or paper notes that could only be used at company-owned businesses. You couldn't take it into the next county and spend it. Other stores wouldn't accept it. Banks wouldn't exchange it at full value. In some places, trying to trade script for cash at a discount could get you in serious trouble. On payday, men stood in line for hours, not to get a paycheck they could save or build a future with, but to be handed tokens that only worked inside the same system that had already decided what those tokens were worth. If you've ever heard the line, "I owe my soul to the company store," that wasn't just a catchy lyric. For a lot of families, that was everyday math. Prices at company stores were often higher than prices in independent towns. Wages were usually set just high enough to cover rent, basic food, and maybe a little credit on top. When a bad season hit, or when somebody got sick and needed medicine, that balance fell apart fast. Families started putting more and more purchases on the book, building tabs that were quietly tracked by store managers. Suddenly, the problem wasn't just that you couldn't save money. It was that you owed money. And the person you owed was the same person who owned your house and decided whether you had a job in the morning. Debt is what turned the company town from a closed loop into a trap. If you wanted to leave, you didn't just need another job. You had to somehow pay off everything you owed, often while your wages were already being docked for tools, doctor visits, or damaged equipment. If you got hurt in the mine, you might end up owing the company hospital too. That's how people ended up spending decades in the same row house, doing the same dangerous work. Not because they loved it, but because every road out of town started with a bill they couldn't pay. What makes company towns so unsettling is that they didn't look like prisons. At first glance, they looked like regular communities. Kids played in the streets, neighbors borrowed sugar from each other, churches held Sunday services and potlucks. But under that ordinary surface, almost everything ran back to the same source of power. If a road needed repairs, the company had to approve it. If a bridge washed out, the company decided how long people would stay cut off. Even the school teacher job could depend on staying in the good graces of management. Housing was one of the clearest ways that control showed up in daily life. Company houses were often built fast and cheap, with nearly identical floor plans and thin walls. You didn't get a deed with your name on it. You got a rental agreement, sometimes barely more than a handshake. That lasted as long as you were employed and considered in good standing. If you got hurt, got fired, or got labeled a troublemaker, you didn't just lose your paycheck. You could lose your home too. In some places, company officials or private guards showed up at the door and supervised the eviction themselves. No matter how long you had lived there, the house was never really yours. Even leisure time could be shaped by the company. Some towns built bowling alleys, theaters, or dance halls, which sounds generous on paper, but those were also great places to keep an eye on people. Who was spending time with who? Who seemed frustrated? Who might be listening to union organizers? Even church life wasn't untouched. In some towns, ministers were quietly expected to preach obedience, patience, and gratitude, and to stay far away from anything that sounded too much like labor rights. A sermon about justice could cost a pastor his job, his parsonage, and his place in the community, all at once. If you want one case study that lays the whole thing bare, you go to Pullman. In the 1880s, railroad magnate George Pullman built what he called a model town for the workers who made his luxury sleeping cars. Pullman, Illinois had brick row houses, tidy yards, paved streets, and a library, and even a man-made lake. Journalists toured it and wrote glowing pieces about how clean and orderly it was. Compared to the crowded slums of Chicago, it really did look like a better life. But like every other company town, the beauty came with strings attached. Pullman owned the homes and the businesses. He set the rents, controlled public spaces, and kept tight control over what was allowed on his land. Alcohol sales were heavily restricted. Local democracy didn't really exist in any meaningful way because the company basically was the government. For a while, as long as the business was profitable and wages stayed high enough to cover the rent, that tension stayed buried under the polished surface. Then the economy crashed in the early 1890s. Railroad orders dropped. Pullman cut wages. What he didn't cut were rents and service charges in the town that still carried his name. Overnight, workers found themselves bringing home less money while still paying the same amount to live in Pullman-owned houses and shop in Pullman-controlled businesses. Families who had already been barely making it suddenly couldn't cover the basics. They asked for relief. Pullman refused. In his mind, the town was a business asset, and it would be run that way no matter what it was doing to the people living in it. That decision lit the fuse on one of the biggest labor conflicts in U.S. history. In 1894, workers at the Pullman plant went on strike. The American Railway Union backed them with a nationwide boycott of trains carrying Pullman cars. Rail traffic tangled up across huge parts of the country. The federal government stepped in. Not on the side of the workers asking for fairer rents or wages, but on the side of the railroads and the mail service. Federal troops were sent in to crush the strike. Violence followed. People died. And when it was over, the strike had been broken, but Pullman's image as some kind of benevolent industrial father was shattered for good. Pullman gets most of the attention in history books, but coal country is where the company town model really sank its teeth in. In the coal fields of Appalachia and other mining regions, entire valleys were divided into clusters of identical houses, each one tied directly to a nearby mine. The work was brutal and dangerous. Explosions, collapses, and black lung were not rare tragedies. They were a part of life. For many families, there were very few alternatives. Farms couldn't support everybody. Other jobs might not exist within any practical distance. So they signed on, moved into company housing, and were paid in scrip that sent them right back to the company store. And that store was more than just a grocery. It was where you bought food, clothes, work tools, and basic supplies for the house. If your kid needed shoes, you went there. If your lamp broke, you went there. If you needed flour, coffee, or kerosene, you went there. Prices were high, and because the company controlled so much of the town, there wasn't any real competition to keep them honest. Some families spent their entire pay before they even left the store. The ledger told management who was always behind, who was barely getting by, and who might be desperate enough to listen when somebody started talking about organizing. Trying to leave a coal company town could feel like trying to climb out of a hole while somebody kept digging under your feet. If you were in debt to the company store, managers might refuse to settle your account cleanly. If you talked too openly about bringing in a union, you could be blacklisted, which meant other mines might refuse to hire you too. In some regions, coal operations shared the names of troublemakers, the way modern companies share background checks. There are documented cases of private detectives and company guards beating, arresting, or even killing labor organizers. So this wasn't just about money. In some places, it became straight up terror dressed up as property protection. One of the strangest things about company towns is what they did to the very idea of public space. In a normal town, the streets, sidewalks, and parks are public. You have certain rights there as a citizen, whether local officials like you or not. In a classic company town, the land itself belonged to the corporation. That meant the company could treat streets and gathering spots as private property, with rules written not by elected officials, but by executives, whose first concern was production and profit. That played out in ways that sound almost absurd now. Handing out union flyers could be treated like trespassing. Holding a meeting in an open lot might get shut down by company police. A speaker on a street corner trying to rally workers could be arrested, not necessarily because of what he was saying, but because the company claimed the right to decide who could stand on that sidewalk at all. It was a strange collision of two ideas. On paper, workers in those towns were citizens of the United States with constitutional rights. In practice, those rights could stop right at the edge of company property. The legal system eventually had to wrestle with that contradiction. Court cases in the mid-1900s started pushing back against the idea that a company could run an entire town like a private factory floor. Judges ruled that certain constitutional protections, including freedom of speech and religion, still mattered in places that looked and functioned like normal towns, even if a corporation technically owned every acre. That didn't solve the power imbalance overnight, but it was a sign that the wider country was finally seeing how strange and how dangerous the company town system really was. Company towns didn't disappear overnight in one dramatic wave of reform. They faded out, shrank down, and changed shape. Several things pushed that process along. Labor movements got stronger. Laws were passed to protect organizing, set wage standards, and limit some of the worst abuses. Transportation improved too, which made it easier for workers to live farther away and commute instead of being forced to live right beside the mill or mine. And on top of that, owners started realizing that running an entire town was expensive. Maintaining roads, water systems, houses, and public buildings on top of the business itself wasn't always worth it. There were also the public relations disasters. The Pullman strike, deadly coal mine clashes, and violent confrontations between workers and company guards made headlines across the country. Middle-class Americans who would never step foot in a mining camp started seeing photos of dirty children outside collapsing company houses and reading about families being evicted after a breadwinner got injured. Reformers and journalists used those stories to argue that something was fundamentally wrong with a system where one employer could control nearly every part of a person's life. Owning a model town stopped looking like progress and started looking like something much uglier. By the mid-1900s, many company towns had either been absorbed into larger municipalities, sold off piece by piece, or abandoned once the resources that made them profitable ran dry. Some became ghost towns, with empty houses and rusting machinery slowly disappearing into weeds and trees. Others still exist today as ordinary towns, their origins hidden under new businesses, renamed streets, and later housing developments. But if you drive through the right parts of the country, you can still see those old rows of identical houses that once came with a job, a set of rules, and a lifetime of dependence built right into the walls. It would be nice to end the story there and say company towns were just a strange historical experiment that collapsed and stayed dead. But the core idea behind them never really went away. Anytime a single employer controls not just your paycheck, but also your housing, your health care, your transportation, or even your ability to stay in the country, you're looking at a softer version of the same problem. The company town was just the most obvious physical expression of a deeper temptation. If a business can make more money by wrapping your whole life around its needs, sooner or later, somebody's going to try it. You can still see echoes of that logic in modern boom towns built around oil fields, mines, or massive industrial plants, where one employer matters so much that a downturn feels like the floor falling out from under an entire region. You can see pieces of it in places where employers provide housing, food, transport, and everything else needed to keep workers on site from morning to night. none of that is automatically evil. Plenty of people genuinely like convenience and stability. But the history of company towns forces one simple question underneath all those perks. If the same entity signs your paycheck, controls your roof, and has a say in whether you have anywhere else to go, how free are you really to say no? For most of us, the story of company towns isn't about moving into a brick row house with a company logo over the door. It's about patterns of dependence and control that can quietly come back wearing new clothes. The coal camp and the model town were obvious. The modern versions are usually cleaner, softer, and wrapped in better branding. The tools change. The logic doesn't. And that's why these forgotten towns carved into hillsides and built beside factories still matter. They're not just relics. They're warning labels left behind by people who learned the hard way what happens when your job stops being one part of your life and starts trying to become the whole thing.